Before we dive deeper into these chilling tales, I want to take a moment to connect with you, my listeners. Wherever you're tuning in from, whether it's a cozy living room, your car on a late-night drive, or your bed with the covers pulled up, I want you to drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. It's incredible to think that while we're all in different places, experiencing life in our own unique ways, we're here together, sharing this moment. Stories have this beautiful way of reminding us that even though our lives may seem so different, we're more alike than we realize. So let's connect. Tell me where you're from, and let's show that no matter where we are in the world, we all share the same curiosity for the unknown. We're not so different after all. When Eric's family inherited Cliffside Manor, a sprawling Victorian estate perched precariously on the edge of a rugged cliff, they thought they had struck gold. The sprawling grounds, elaborate architecture, and antique furniture spoke of a bygone era of wealth and prestige. The catch? It had been uninhabited for decades, abandoned under mysterious circumstances. Eric, a budding filmmaker with a penchant for the eerie, decided to document their journey restoring the old manor. He planned to create a series of videos chronicling the process, hoping to blend his love of horror storytelling with his family's new project. "This house has secrets," Eric quipped in his first video. It was meant as a joke, but he had no idea how right he was. The first few days were uneventful. Eric and his parents began cleaning the massive house, uncovering layers of dust and decay. As they explored, they noticed peculiarities. The house seemed to groan more than it should, as though it were alive. Cold spots materialized in random places, even in the middle of summer. And then there were the mirrors. Nearly every room was lined with large, ornate mirrors that seemed designed to catch every angle of the house. Eric's camera began picking up strange glitches. In one clip, while filming a dusty parlor room, he noticed a shadow dart across the background. There had been no one else in the room. Shrugging it off as a technical issue, Eric decided to keep filming, chalking it up to his overactive imagination. But things escalated. One night, Eric set up his camera to capture time-lapse footage of the manor at night. He reviewed the footage the next morning and found something that froze his blood. At precisely 3:12 a.m., the camera caught movement in one of the mirrors in the main hall. A dark figure stepped into view, its features blurred but unmistakably humanoid. It didn't move like a person, though. It twitched and jerked unnaturally before vanishing. Eric showed the clip to his parents. His dad dismissed it as a trick of the light, but his mom was less convinced. "There's something wrong with this place," she said quietly. Over the next few weeks, Eric started noticing the figure more often. It appeared in mirrors, reflections in windows, even in the polished surface of the grand dining table. Sometimes it seemed to be watching him. The more he filmed, the more it seemed to appear, almost as if his camera was summoning it. One night, Eric woke to a sound he couldn't identify. It was faint but rhythmic, like someone tapping gently on glass. He crept out of bed, following the noise to the hallway. There, every mirror he passed had faint handprints on them, but from the inside. The tapping grew louder as he approached the main hall. His breath caught in his throat when he saw it. The figure was no longer confined to reflections. It stood at the foot of the grand staircase, a mass of shifting shadows, its form barely human. It had no face, but Eric could feel its gaze, heavy and invasive. As he stepped back, the thing lunged toward him with inhuman speed, vanishing just before it made contact. The next morning, Eric demanded they leave. His parents, growing increasingly worried about his mental state, agreed. But as they packed their belongings, Eric's camera captured one final chilling detail. In every frame of footage, the shadowy figure was there, just at the edge of the shot, watching them pack, as though it were waiting for them to go. The family left Cliffside Manor that afternoon, abandoning their plans to restore it. Eric uploaded a heavily edited video of their time there, leaving out the most terrifying parts. He wanted to warn others about the house, but feared no one would believe him. The final shot of his video was a wide-angle shot of the manor as they drove away. In one of the second-story windows, a shadowy figure stood, watching them go. Eric never touched his camera again. Eric didn't touch his camera again because the last piece of footage it captured before he turned it off haunted him beyond anything he could rationalize. The day after leaving Cliffside Manor, Eric sat in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by moving boxes filled with what little they salvaged from the doomed project. He plugged his camera into his laptop, intending to delete the files. He wanted to forget everything, but curiosity got the better of him. He decided to review the last few minutes of footage, hoping it might offer closure or confirm his sanity. The recording began as they loaded the car. His mom carried boxes while his dad grumbled about leaving behind valuable antiques. Then the camera shifted as Eric adjusted the tripod to frame the entire house. The image was perfectly still, a wide-angle shot of the manor, bathed in the pale light of an overcast afternoon. At first, nothing seemed out of place. But as Eric scrubbed through the footage, something changed. He noticed a flicker in one of the second-story windows, the same window where the shadow had appeared when they drove away. This time, however, it didn't vanish. Eric slowed the footage to half speed. The shadow was clearer now, not just a figure, but a face. Or rather, the suggestion of a face. It had no features, just vague impressions of eyes and a mouth, as though someone had blurred an image into oblivion, and it was staring directly at the camera. Then it moved. The shadow seemed to flow, stretching itself thin like ink running down a page. It spread through the window frame, spilling into the air outside. Eric's heart pounded as the shadow crept down the exterior wall of the house, slithering like smoke, heading toward the camera. He paused the footage, his hand trembling. "No, no, no," he whispered, closing the laptop lid. But he couldn't leave it alone. He opened it again and pressed play. The shadow reached the ground in the footage, pooling like liquid before reforming into the figure, taller, sharper, more defined than ever before. Its head tilted as though observing the camera, curious. Then, slowly, it began to walk forward, its jerky movements punctuated by the crackling sound of the audio distorting. With every step it took, the static grew louder until Eric couldn't hear anything else. Just as the figure filled the frame, it stopped. It raised a hand, long, spindly fingers extending toward the camera lens. A sudden burst of static filled the screen, and the recording cut off. Eric's camera turned off on its own. Shaking, Eric unplugged the camera and shoved it into a drawer. He stared at his laptop screen, half expecting the shadow to appear in the reflection. For days, he didn't sleep, his mind replaying the footage on an endless loop. Every shadow in his room felt alive, every sound amplified. He began to feel watched, even in his own home. One night, weeks later, Eric woke to a familiar sound, the faint, rhythmic tapping of fingers on glass. His blood turned to ice as he realized it was coming from his bedroom window. He turned his head slowly, afraid of what he might see. The window was dark, the glass fogged with condensation. But in the center of the pane were handprints. They weren't his. Then came the tapping again. He scrambled out of bed, heart hammering in his chest, and turned on every light in his room. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed on his eardrums. He dared to look at the window again, and this time, there was nothing there. In the days that followed, Eric became consumed with paranoia. He locked his camera away in the attic, along with the laptop containing the footage. But the shadows followed him. He'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of his eye, pooling beneath doorways or shifting unnaturally in the dark corners of rooms. Eric's parents dismissed his fears, chalking them up to stress and overwork. But he knew better. The shadow wasn't confined to Cliffside Manor anymore. Somehow, it had followed him, and worse, it was growing bolder. One evening, Eric returned home from a short walk to clear his head. He froze in the doorway. All the lights in the house were off, though he distinctly remembered leaving them on. The house was unnaturally still, heavy with an oppressive silence. His stomach churned as he stepped inside. The air was thick, humid, and cold. As he reached for the light switch, the shadows shifted, almost imperceptibly, like ripples in water. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of his camera powering on. The noise came from the attic. Eric's heart threatened to burst out of his chest as he slowly climbed the creaking stairs. Each step felt heavier, the air pressing against him like an invisible weight. He reached the attic door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. From inside, he could hear faint, distorted audio, the last sounds from his recording at Cliffside Manor. Gathering every ounce of courage, Eric flung open the door. The attic was empty except for his camera, sitting on the floor, pointed directly at the doorway. Its red recording light blinked steadily. Eric's breath caught in his throat as the screen flickered to life. It was displaying live footage of himself, but in the frame there was a shadow standing right behind him. Eric turned around, but there was nothing there. When he looked back at the screen, the shadow moved closer, its featureless face inches from his own. The camera's screen went black, and the room was plunged into total darkness. Eric's screams echoed through the house, but by the time his parents arrived, the attic was empty. The camera and laptop were gone. All that remained were faint, blackened handprints on the walls and a lingering sense of something watching from the corners. Eric moved out of his parents' home shortly after, but the shadow wasn't finished with him. Every now and then, he'd wake in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping on his window, or the faint glow of a camera light blinking from the darkness. To this day, Eric refuses to film anything, fearing that with every frame captured, the shadow draws closer to finally claiming him. Growing up, Emily had always loved road trips. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt, the freedom of the open road, and the quiet introspection it allowed were comforting. After graduating college, she decided to take a solo road trip across the country, a final act of independence before settling into her new job. Her journey was meticulously planned, scenic routes, charming motels, and landmarks she'd only seen in magazines. But one night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the empty highway stretched endlessly before her, Emily found herself far from civilization. The radio crackled faintly, static blending with a low hum. She fiddled with the dial, searching for a station, when her headlights illuminated a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. It was a man, dressed in what looked like a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The highway had been desolate for hours, not a single car passing by. She slowed instinctively, her foot hovering over the brake. Something about him seemed off, unnatural. His posture was rigid, his head slightly tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. As she passed, the figure turned its head sharply toward her car, and though she couldn't make out his features, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She accelerated, glancing nervously in a rearview mirror. The man remained standing where she had seen him, growing smaller in the distance until he vanished into the darkness. She laughed nervously at herself, brushing it off as paranoia. "It's just some hitchhiker," she muttered, trying to shake the unease creeping up her spine. But a few miles later, Emily's heart dropped. In the faint glow of her headlights, she saw the man again, standing on the shoulder. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. She hadn't turned off the highway. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of her. She sped past, refusing to slow down this time. The figure didn't move but followed her with that same unnerving tilt of the head. For the next hour, Emily didn't dare to stop. She blasted the radio to drown out her thoughts, her mind racing with questions. Every shadow cast by her headlights looked like the man. Finally, the lights of a small diner appeared on the horizon. Relieved, she pulled into the gravel lot and parked beneath one of the buzzing neon signs. The diner was nearly empty, save for a waitress and a trucker nursing a cup of coffee. Emily ordered a meal she didn't want and tried to shake off the lingering tension. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting the man to walk in. When the waitress brought her coffee, Emily asked if anyone else had passed through recently. A hitchhiker, maybe? The waitress raised an eyebrow. "Honey, no one's been out there all night. Just you." Emily forced a smile, but couldn't shake the unease. She decided to get back on the road, hoping to make it to the next town before calling it a night. As she returned to her car, the air felt heavier, the quiet more oppressive. She checked the back seat reflexively before getting in, locking the doors as soon as she was behind the wheel. Pulling out onto the empty highway, Emily kept her eyes on the road, refusing to look into the rearview mirror. But the unease followed her like a shadow. Her headlights caught something on the road ahead. This time, it wasn't the man standing on the shoulder. It was him standing directly in the middle of the lane. Emily slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching against the asphalt. The car came to a halt mere feet from the figure. She gripped the steering wheel, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The man stood motionless, his face still hidden in the shadows. Her headlights illuminated his form clearly now, tall, gaunt, and utterly still. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed directly at her. Adrenaline surged through Emily. She shifted into reverse, her car lurching backward before she spun the wheel, executing a desperate U-turn. She sped away, heart pounding, her eyes flickering between the road and her rearview mirror. The man was gone. After what felt like an eternity, Emily saw the distant glow of motel lights. She pulled into the lot and rushed inside, her nerves frayed. The clerk gave her a key without much conversation, and she barricaded herself in the room, double-checking the locks on the door and windows. Exhausted, she finally collapsed onto the bed. She couldn't shake the image of the man from her mind, his stillness, his pointed gesture. Sleep came in fits, her dreams plagued by the memory of his dark silhouette. At 3 a.m., Emily woke with a start. The room was deathly quiet. She sat up, her pulse racing, and looked around. Everything seemed normal, until she noticed her car keys weren't where she left them. They were on the floor, near the door, as if someone had dropped them. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't touched them since locking the door. She backed toward the bed, her breath shallow. That's when she noticed something even more horrifying. The bathroom door was ajar, and the light inside was on. She hadn't turned it on. Emily stared at the sliver of light, paralyzed by fear. A shadow moved within. Someone was in there. She grabbed her phone and called 911, whispering her location and that someone had broken into her room. The operator stayed on the line, assuring her that help was on the way. The minutes felt like hours. She heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder. Emily kept her eyes fixed on the bathroom door, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Suddenly, the light flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, save for the red and blue lights flashing outside. There was a loud knock on her door. "Police!" a voice called out. Emily ran to the door, yanked it open, and practically collapsed into the arms of the officers. They searched the room thoroughly but found no one. The bathroom was empty, the window sealed shut. As the officers escorted her to safety, one of them stopped and turned back. "You said someone was in here?" he asked. Emily nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, I saw a shadow in the bathroom." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "Ma'am, there's only one set of footprints in the room. Yours." Emily's stomach dropped. She glanced back at the motel room one last time as the officers walked her to their car. The bathroom door was ajar again, and in the darkness, she thought she saw the faint outline of a figure standing just behind it. She never took a solo road trip again. In the tiny, forgotten town of Willow Bend, nestled deep in the Appalachian woods, there was a legend. Everyone who grew up there had heard it at some point. The story revolved around an old, decrepit well in the heart of the forest. Locals called it the Echo Well, but not because it echoed. No, the name came from something much stranger. The tale went that if you whispered your name into the well at midnight, you'd hear a voice repeat it back. But the voice wouldn't sound like yours. Worse, if you ever responded, you'd vanish, taken by whatever lurked beneath the ground. Of course, every small town has its myths, but the Echo Well was different. Kids didn't dare test it, even during dares or drunken outings. Something about it felt off. It wasn't just the legend. It was the eerie stillness of the area, the unnatural chill that seemed to cling to the stones, and the way animals avoided it completely. I heard the story when I was 10, during a campfire gathering. My best friend, Matt, swore he'd seen the well once, while hiking with his dad. "The air around it is heavy," he said. "It feels like the forest is holding its breath." Years later, after moving away for college, I found myself back in Willow Bend. Matt had never left. He worked as a park ranger, guiding the occasional lost hiker or cataloging wildlife. One evening, over beers, I brought up the well. "You ever go back there?" I asked. His face paled slightly. "Once," he said, setting down his bottle. "I don't talk about it." That was all he said. I pressed him, but he refused to elaborate, his normally cheerful demeanor replaced with something darker. I let it go, but his unease stayed with me. The next morning, Matt texted me, "If you want to see the well, meet me at the old trailhead at dusk. Bring a flashlight." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no. The well had always been a joke, a piece of local lore to scare kids. But Matt's seriousness piqued my curiosity. I agreed. When I arrived, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the dense trees. Matt was already there, flashlight in hand. He didn't say much, just motioned for me to follow. The hike was longer than I expected. The trail grew narrower, the air colder. It felt like the forest itself was closing in. Finally, after nearly an hour, Matt stopped. "There," he whispered. At first, I didn't see it. The well was camouflaged by moss and vines, almost as if the earth was trying to swallow it. The stones were cracked and uneven, and a rotting wooden cover lay discarded nearby. Matt gestured for me to stay back. "Don't get too close," he said, his voice barely audible. Despite the growing darkness, I couldn't help but inch forward. There was something hypnotic about the well, an inexplicable pull. I peered into the abyss. It was black, so black it seemed to absorb the faint beam of my flashlight. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive. "Is it true?" I asked. "About the voice?" Matt didn't answer immediately. He stared at the well, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he finally said. "It's true." I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Instead, he turned to leave. We shouldn't stay. But I wasn't ready to leave. The well had a strange hold on me. Against my better judgment, I leaned closer and whispered my name into the void. At first, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, faintly, I heard it. A whisper, distant yet distinct. "Ethan." The voice didn't sound like mine. It was lower, raspier, and tinged with something I couldn't place. My stomach twisted. "Let's go," Matt said, grabbing my arm. His grip was firm, almost desperate. As we walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest felt alive, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. Matt didn't speak the entire way. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voice replayed in my mind over and over. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like an invitation or a warning. The next morning, Matt was gone. His truck was still in his driveway, but there was no sign of him. I called, texted, even drove to his favorite spots, but he had vanished. I went to the sheriff, but they weren't concerned. "Probably just out camping," they said. But I knew better. I couldn't stop thinking about the well. Against all logic, I returned to the trailhead the following evening. The hike felt shorter this time, as if the forest was guiding me. When I reached the well, the air was colder than before. My breath came out in visible puffs, though it was the middle of summer. "Matt!" I called, my voice trembling. The well was silent. Then, faintly, from deep within, I heard it. "Ethan." The voice was louder this time, closer. My chest tightened. "What do you want?" I whispered. The response was immediate, echoing up from the darkness. "Come closer." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground. Slowly, almost involuntarily, I stepped forward, and that's when I saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, reached up from the blackness, its fingers curling over the edge of the well. Then another. A figure began to rise, its face obscured by shadow. It was impossibly tall, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Leave him alone!" a voice shouted. I turned to see Matt, disheveled and wild-eyed, charging toward me. He yanked me back, and the two of us sprinted into the forest. Behind us, the air filled with an inhuman screech, so loud it felt like it was tearing my eardrums apart. We didn't stop running until we reached the trailhead. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. Matt looked at me, his face pale. "You shouldn't have gone back," he said. "Once you hear the voice, it doesn't stop." I stared at him, my mind racing. "What was that thing?" Matt didn't answer. He just shook his head. "I don't know, but it won't let you go." That was the last time I saw Matt. A week later, he disappeared again. This time, for good. And as for me, the voice hasn't stopped. No matter where I go, no matter what I do, I hear it. Soft, persistent, calling my name. "Ethan, there's a rule most seasoned drivers know when traveling through the Midwest at night. Never stop for a hitchhiker on Route 27. It's a superstition whispered at diners and gas stations, told by truckers and locals alike. Most dismiss it as a ghost story, a cautionary tale meant to keep weary drivers from falling prey to opportunistic strangers. I used to think the same, until the night I broke the rule. I'm a long-haul trucker, have been for nearly 2 decades. I've driven every major highway in the U.S., and I've seen my share of weird things. Phantom headlights, lights in the sky, and people appearing in the middle of nowhere. But nothing comes close to what happened on Route 27. It was a cold October night, and I was hauling a load from Chicago to Dallas. My route took me through miles of flat, empty farmland, with nothing but the hum of my engine and the occasional crackle of the radio to keep me company. The moon was a thin sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the endless stretch of road ahead. I was about halfway through the route when I saw him. A figure stood on the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. He was tall and lanky, dressed in jeans and a hoodie, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. His arm was outstretched, thumb up in the universal sign, for a ride. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's a liability. Too many horror stories about stolen rigs and worse. But something about this guy gave me pause. Maybe it was the way he stood so still, like a statue, or the faint glint of something metallic in his hand. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. As I got closer, I realized what he was holding. A sign. Scrawled in black marker were 4 words that sent a chill down my spine. Please, I need help. I rolled down my window slightly. You okay, buddy? He didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in years, he said, "They're coming." Before I could ask who they were, he climbed into the cab without waiting for an invitation. I should have kicked him out then and there, but something about his demeanor stopped me. He looked haunted. His eyes were sunken, darting to every shadow, as if he expected something to leap out at him. He smelled faintly of dirt and mildew, like he'd been buried underground. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Anywhere but here," he whispered. I pulled back onto the road, keeping one eye on him. He stared out the window, silent, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. "So, what's your name?" I ventured. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "Just drive and don't stop, no matter what." His words set me on edge. "What do you mean, don't stop? What's going on?" He turned to me then, his eyes wide and bloodshot. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. I glanced in my rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely afraid. The road behind us was empty, but his fear was contagious. "Try me," I said. He hesitated, then said, "They're shadows, but they're alive. They hunt, and they're coming for me." I almost laughed. Almost. But there was something in his voice, something raw and desperate, that made me swallow my skepticism. "What do you mean, shadows?" I asked. "You'll see," he said, his voice barely audible. For the next several miles we drove in silence. My knuckles were tight on the wheel, my mind racing. The air in the cab felt heavier, colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled to life. A burst of static, followed by a voice I didn't recognize. "You can't outrun them." I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding slightly on the asphalt. "What the hell was that?" The hitchhiker grabbed my arm. "I told you not to stop," he hissed. But it was too late. The road ahead was empty, but something moved in the distance. At first I thought it was fog rolling in, but it was too dark, too solid. It spread across the horizon like ink spilling into water, and as it got closer, I saw shapes forming within it, tall, thin, and humanoid, with glowing red eyes. "Drive!" the hitchhiker screamed. I hit the gas, my engine roaring as we sped down the highway. The shadows followed, their movement unnaturally fast and fluid. They didn't run. They glided, their forms flickering like flames in the wind. "Faster!" the hitchhiker shouted. "I'm going as fast as I can!" I yelled back. The shadows gained on us, their forms becoming clearer. They weren't human. Their bodies were twisted, their limbs too long, their mouths too wide, and those eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes, were locked on us. Suddenly, the truck shuddered. The engine sputtered, then died, leaving us coasting to a stop. "No, no, no," the hitchhiker muttered, his voice trembling. I tried the ignition, but it wouldn't turn over. Outside, the shadows surrounded us, their forms pressing against the cab like a suffocating fog. "What do they want?" I whispered. He looked at me, his face pale. "Me. But if you're here, they'll take you too." Before I could respond, the shadows began to seep through the cracks in the doors and windows, their tendrils curling around the dashboard and seats. The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure on my chest, as if the life was being drained out of me. "Get out!" the hitchhiker yelled. We scrambled out of the cab and ran into the field beside the road. The shadows followed, their forms stretching and warping in the moonlight. "This way!" he shouted, leading me toward a grove of trees. As we ran, I felt something tug at my ankle. I looked down and saw a shadowy tendril wrapping around my boot. I kicked and stumbled, falling hard onto the ground. The hitchhiker turned back, his face etched with panic. "Don't stop!" he screamed. But it was too late. The shadows closed in, their glowing eyes filling my vision. The shadows were all around me now, twisting and contorting like living smoke. Their glowing red eyes burned into mine, and I felt an overwhelming cold seep into my body. My limbs went numb, my thoughts clouded, and it was like they were pulling me into them, erasing me. And then, from somewhere nearby, I heard the hitchhiker's voice. "Take me," he shouted. "Leave him alone." The shadows hesitated, their forms flickering as if they were considering his words. Slowly, they turned toward him. He stood a few yards away, arms spread wide, trembling but resolute. "You want me, right?" he said, his voice cracking. "I'm the one who escaped. Take me and let him go." The tendrils around me loosened and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I looked up just in time to see the shadows surge toward the hitchhiker, engulfing him in their swirling mass. He screamed, a raw, soul-wrenching sound that cut through the night. And then, he was gone. The shadows dissipated, fading into the darkness like they had never been there at all. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. I staggered to my feet, my entire body shaking. The truck was still there, parked on the shoulder, but the hitchhiker was gone. There wasn't even a trace of him, not a footprint, not a single thread of his clothing. I climbed back into the cab, my hands trembling as I tried the ignition. This time, the engine roared to life. I floored it, desperate to get as far away from that stretch of road as possible. When I reached the nearest truck stop, I parked and stumbled inside, my mind racing. I needed to tell someone, anyone, what had happened. But when I tried to explain, the words wouldn't come. How could I describe shadows that hunted like wolves, or a man who had willingly sacrificed himself to save me? Instead, I just sat at the counter, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Months later, I was back on the road, still haunted by that night. I avoided Route 27, like the plague, even if it added hours to my route. But no matter how far I stayed away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, one night, I found a package waiting for me in the mailroom of my company's depot. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in shaky handwriting. Inside was a small, worn notebook. It was the hitchhiker's. I opened it, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with frantic, disjointed entries, descriptions of the shadows, their glowing eyes, the way they moved. But one passage stood out, written in bold, erratic letters. "They don't stop. They never stop. If you see them, run. If they catch you, don't let them take you whole." The last page had just one line. "They're coming for you next." I slammed the notebook shut, my breath hitching. I knew I should throw it away, burn it, do something to get rid of it. But instead, I locked it in my glove compartment. Now, every time I'm on the road, I check my mirrors obsessively, scanning for any hint of movement in the shadows. And sometimes, when the road is quiet and the moon is hidden behind clouds, I swear I can see them. Just turns, keeping pace with my truck, waiting. It started with a wrong turn. I was driving through rural Montana, where highways seemed to stretch forever into the horizon. My GPS had lost signal hours ago, and I was relying on handwritten directions scrawled on a piece of paper. I was en route to a cabin I'd rented for some much-needed alone time. But somewhere along the way, I missed a turn. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the golden fields of Montana turned a muted gray, and a strange unease crept in. The road I was on wasn't marked. It was barely a road at all, more like a trail carved into the earth. I figured it was a shortcut or an old back road and decided to keep going. 15 minutes later, my headlights caught a wooden sign with faded white letters. Coldwood. There was no indication of what Coldwood was. A town? A landmark? But my curiosity got the better of me. I followed the trail into the woods, and soon enough, I saw a cluster of buildings. Coldwood was a town, or at least it had been. The buildings were decrepit, their wood splintered and roofs caved in. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A ghost town, I thought. A relic of history. Something about the silence felt oppressive. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, not even the chirp of insects. My car engine seemed deafening in the stillness, so I turned it off. I stepped out and took in the eerie scene. A church with shattered windows loomed at the center of town, its steeple crooked. A row of small homes sat in various states of decay, their doors hanging ajar. The unease grew stronger when I noticed something odd. Every door, every window, every opening was covered in hand-carved symbols. Circles, triangles, intersecting lines, all etched deep into the wood. Some had faded with time, but others looked fresh, as if someone had carved them recently. I decided to take a closer look at the church. As I approached, I noticed that the ground beneath my boots was soft, like walking on a sponge. When I crouched down, I realized it wasn't just dirt. It was ash. The entire town seemed to be covered in a fine layer of it. When I stepped into the church, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable. Burnt wood and something metallic, like iron. The pews were mostly intact, though warped and blackened in places. The altar was covered in the same symbols I'd seen outside, but these were painted in a dark, sticky substance. I didn't want to think about what it might be. I heard a noise behind me, a faint scuffle, like something brushing against the floor. I whipped around, but the church was empty. The air felt thicker, heavier. I decided I'd seen enough and walked back to my car, but when I reached it, the front left tire was flat. Panic set in as I realized just how isolated I was. My phone still had no signal, and the nearest town, if there even was one, was miles away. I had no choice but to stay in Coldwood for the night. I grabbed my flashlight, a blanket, and a knife from the trunk, and locked myself in the car. Sleep didn't come easy. Every so often I thought I heard faint whispers, but I told myself it was just the wind. At one point, I saw movement outside, a shadow darting between the buildings. I gripped the knife tighter and didn't dare move until dawn. When the sun rose, the town looked different. It wasn't just the light. The buildings seemed less decayed, as if the town had somehow repaired itself overnight. The ash on the ground was gone, and most chilling of all, the symbols on the doors and windows had changed. They were no longer crude and weathered. They were clean, sharp, and glowing faintly. I knew I had to leave. I couldn't fix the tire, so I decided to walk back the way I came. But when I turned onto the trail that had brought me to Coldwood, it wasn't there. In its place was dense forest. I couldn't even see tire tracks from my car. Panic surged as I realized I was trapped. Coldwood wasn't just a ghost town. It was something else entirely, something alive. And it didn't want me to leave. The forest felt suffocating, its dense canopy swallowing every ray of sunlight. I turned back to face Coldwood, my heart pounding in my chest. The town looked different again. The buildings weren't decrepit anymore. They stood tall, their wood polished and unblemished, as if the years had peeled away in an instant. Smoke rose from the chimneys of a few homes, and the church bell began to chime. The sound echoed unnaturally, too loud for its surroundings, reverberating through the woods like a warning. I took a step toward the town, unsure of what else to do. My car was still parked where I'd left it, but now the flat tire was fully inflated. Something wanted me to stay. I decided to head to one of the houses. If someone was there, maybe they could help me. As I approached, the front door creaked open. I froze, waiting for someone to appear, but no one did. The interior was dimly lit, with sunlight filtering through clean, intact windows. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. No response. I stepped inside, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. The living room was sparse but tidy, as if someone had just stepped out. A rocking chair by the fireplace swayed gently, even though there was no breeze. The air was heavy with the smell of something sweet, like honey, but sharper, closer to decay. On the mantel above the fireplace was a picture frame. I approached it cautiously, my hand trembling as I picked it up. It was a photograph of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 young children. But their faces were blurred, smudged as if the photograph had been smeared by an unseen hand. A voice broke the silence behind me, a child's voice, soft and lilting. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around, my heart racing. Standing in the doorway was a little girl, no older than 8. She wore a simple white dress, her bare feet blackened with soot. Her eyes were too large for her face, dark and glistening like polished stones. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head and smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "They're watching you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to hide." "Hide? From what?" Before she could answer, the church bell chimed again. The sound was deafening, shaking the walls of the house. The girl's expression changed, her smile dropping into a look of pure terror. "They're coming," she whispered. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of the house, my legs carrying me back toward my car. The town seemed to shift around me as I ran. Buildings appeared where there had been none before, and the streets twisted and turned, leading me in circles. The bell continued to toll, each chime growing louder and more dissonant. When I reached the car, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. The keys were still in the ignition. I turned them, praying the engine would start. It roared to life, and I slammed on the gas. The car lurched forward, but the road ahead was gone. Instead, the path led straight into the church. The bell had stopped, but now I could hear something else. A low, guttural chanting that seemed to emanate from the walls of the church itself. I had no choice. I had to go inside. The doors swung open as I approached, revealing a scene that froze me in my tracks. The pews were filled with people, their heads bowed, but their faces were wrong. They were twisted and featureless, like melted wax. At the center of the room stood the girl from the house. She turned to face me, her eyes black as coal. "They want you to stay," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "But you have to leave. Now." "I tried," I shouted. "There's no way out." She pointed to the altar where a large wooden box sat. It was covered in the same symbols that adorned the buildings outside. The chanting grew louder, the faceless figures rising from the pews. "Open it," the girl said. I hesitated, my hands shaking as I approached the box. The figures began to move toward me, their steps slow but deliberate. The air grew colder with each passing second, my breath visible in the dim light. I reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was a mirror, but it wasn't my reflection staring back at me. It was the girl's face, her eyes wide with fear. "Take it," she said. "Take the mirror, and don't look back." I grabbed the mirror, its surface ice cold. The moment I lifted it from the box, the chanting stopped. The figures froze in place, their heads snapping toward me in unison. A deafening roar erupted from the church, and the walls began to crumble. I ran. I didn't look back. Not when the ground beneath me trembled. Not when the screams of the faceless figures echoed in my ears. Not even when I heard the girl's voice one last time calling out, "Don't stop running!" When I finally reached the edge of the woods, the mirror shattered in my hands. I stumbled onto a paved road, gasping for breath. A passing truck stopped, and the driver got out, asking if I was okay. I turned back to look at the forest, but Coldwood was gone. I stood there, staring into the forest that had swallowed me whole just minutes before, or hours, or days. Time felt like a thread, unraveled and scattered. The truck driver, a gruff man in his 50s with a thick southern drawl, repeated his question. "Hey, buddy, you all right? Need a hospital?" I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak. My hands trembled as I wiped my face, only to realize they were coated in dirt and specks of glass, the remnants of the mirror. The man followed my gaze to the woods. "Coldwood," I croaked, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "The town." The man's face darkened, his expression shifting from concern to something resembling fear. "You said Coldwood?" His voice dropped an octave. "Ain't no such place around here, son." "It was there," I insisted, my voice cracking. "The church, the people, the girl, it's gone," he interrupted, his tone firm. "If it ever was. Folks around here know better than to go wandering in them woods. Strange things happen to people who do." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. My legs felt like lead, and my vision blurred. The man helped me into the truck, and as we drove off, I fought to stay awake. When I woke, I was in a hospital bed. The sterile smell of disinfectant stung my nose, and the beeping of machines was a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the forest. A nurse appeared, smiling kindly. "You're lucky," she said, checking my vitals. "That truck driver said you were wandering along the highway looking like you'd been through hell. You were dehydrated and had a nasty fever." I nodded weakly, my mind racing. "My phone," I rasped. "Where's my phone?" She handed it to me from the bedside table. The screen was cracked but still functional. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the photos I'd taken before entering the woods. The images of Coldwood, the church, the strange symbols. They were gone, replaced with black screens and corrupted files. My stomach twisted. Had it all been in my head? But then I noticed something. A single intact photo. It wasn't one I remembered taking. It was of the girl, standing in the doorway of the house. Her eyes were dark, her expression haunting. Beneath the photo was a caption, typed out as if someone else had written it. "Don't forget." The nurse noticed my pale face and asked if I was okay. I nodded and locked the phone, unable to look at the picture any longer. Over the next few days, I tried to piece my life back together. But the nightmares didn't stop. The girl appeared in my dreams every night, her voice echoing. "They're watching you." Every shadow seemed to move. Every quiet moment felt oppressive, as if the forest hadn't let me go completely. A week later, I received an unmarked package at my door. Inside was an old wooden box, identical to the one from the church. My hands shook as I opened it. half expecting to find another mirror. Instead, there was only a small slip of paper with 2 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Come back." I slammed the lid shut and threw the box into the trash. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Coldwood wasn't done with me. And as much as I wanted to forget, as much as I wanted to run, I couldn't shake the feeling that one day I'd find myself back in that cursed town. Or worse, Coldwood would find me.